I'm excited to be joined this morning by George M. Johnson. I'm excited because there's a conversation that has to be had about the effects of everything that we see happening around us as it pertains to critical race theory, the fight against banning certain books, and even in the state of Florida, the fight against the LGBTQI community that's being waged by people like the governor there, Ron DeSantis. George Johnson is the award-winning Black non-binary writer, author, and activist based in the New York City area. They have written on race, gender, sex, and culture for Essence, The Advocate, BuzzFeed News, Teen Vogue, and more than 40 other national publications. They are the author of All Boys Aren't Blue, which has been banned now in nearly 20 states. I want to repeat that. They have banned this book, All Boys Aren't Blue, in 20 states. George, thank you so much for joining us. How are you this morning?
Thank you for having me. I'm awake. I'm in LA, so it's just turned 6:30. But I'm excited to be here.
We appreciate you getting up that early. I know the West Coast is a monster when we try to do these live shows on the East Coast, so we really do appreciate it. Tell us, if you don't mind, about the book All Boys Aren't Blue and what you're fighting against now, which is a full-on court press to ban your book everywhere.
Yeah, my book, All Boys Aren't Blue, is pretty simple. It's just my life story from birth until the age of 21, growing up as a Black kid in a small city called Plainfield, New Jersey, who always knew that I was different, even if I didn't have the language to understand what different was. And so the book really just showcases my journey through childhood, through being a young adult and going to college. But it tells the true story of what that existence is like at the intersection of Blackness and queerness. And my story also intersects and weaves in a lot of moments from my family, because my family was very queer affirming, which is something that we don't often hear about or talk about within the Black family dynamic. And so it's really a love letter to my grandmother in many ways, but it's a story about family and just one person's journey, myself, on, through the age of discovery.
What about almost 20 states? That is a huge statement to the threat that those people, that group, that cabal see your work. I want to take this in two steps. What about your work makes them so afraid? And then two, how could we best describe that group that is now almost at 20 states banning your book?
Yeah. My book, at the root of my book, it tells the truth. My book simply tells the truth. The sections that they are pinpointing are two in particular. One where I discuss a sexual abuse that I experienced when I was around the age of 12. And a second section where I talk about losing my virginity, and I was a little bit older. I was around the age of 21. And so in both of those sections, though, I do depict what is going on. I talk about what the experience was like. I talk about it, very boldly and vividly what actually happened in those two instances. But they're trying to say that what I'm selling is pornography, when realistically, what I'm selling in the one chapter is teaching youth about consent. It's teaching the youth about grooming. It's teaching the youth about how to recognize sexual trauma and repress trauma. And in the other section, it's literally a critique on how poor our sex education system is in the United States, so much so that people who are queer don't even know that they're at risk, at much higher risk for HIV, and how we have to really update the sexual education systems in this country because our kids really don't know about consent. And the only places that we can learn about sex from oftentimes becomes pornography, which is why so many have a warped view of what sex actually is versus the main depiction of what most of us can see.
There's a lot there. And I can say there's a lot there because anyone who has dealt with trauma either personally or cared for someone who's dealt with trauma understands that you don't heal until you address it. You can't move past trauma until you actually can verbalize it and discuss it. And so it's almost as if their argument makes no sense if they're saying you discussing trauma is going to cause trauma. It doesn't make sense. I can see it from a homophobic kind of generalized fear of bigoted fear that they're so used to in this country. I don't get the logical argument from their perspective, which leads me to the second question. Who are these people specifically? Because I sometimes generalize and say like white supremacists or conservatives, but that group might be a lot bigger than that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's not a large group. It's mainly a group called the Moms for Liberty and No Left Turn in Education, I believe, is the second group. Not huge groups. It's not 1 million people after us. Even when you look at the numbers, it's always like 2 parents complained about this book to get it pulled. 3 parents complained about this book to get it pulled. 1 parent complained about this book to get it pulled. So it's not like a huge group. They're just a group that is very well mobilized. And so they're in all 50 states. They have about 135 chapters in terms of the Moms for Liberty. And so they just have basically made a coordinated attack against a list. They just have a list of books and they all just go to their school boards and complain about the list. None of them have read the book. And realistically, they are living under a conservative ideology that is built in purity of white children and innocence of white children. And because of that, they're rooted in that ideology. They feel that anything that either downplays the history of this country, talks about how the forefathers were slave owners and rapists, because my book does that too, or talks about experiences that aren't of their pure children who are going to be jaded by my Black queer experience, then those books need to be pulled.
So a small, concentrated group that has a list. And I've been following this story for a minute. You can't help but follow how many people are being attacked in this space. But it's not happenstance that other books on that list directly address what you already listed: white supremacy, systemic racism, critical race theory in the generalized sense, not in the theoretical sense per se. But tell me, why is it so easy to go just from one ism to the next? All of the phobias from one to the next. It's like there's a very small step to go from being a racist bigoted to being a misogynist bigoted or a homophobic bigot. Tell us, if we don't catch it on one, how is it so easy to miss it on all the others?
Yeah, I think people don't realize how systems of oppression are all interconnected. And so oftentimes when you hear people talk about a system of oppression, they talk about it from a very siloed standpoint. And so people will talk about healthcare, but don't talk about how K through 12 feeds into socioeconomic status, feeds into healthcare, feeds into police brutality, right? And so it's which is why when people first started talking about the school to prison pipeline, it kind of blew people's minds because they didn't realize that these two systems, i.e. the criminal justice system and the K through 12 education system, were so interconnected into what plays out in specifically Black and brown children's lives, as it was pushing the kids into that system from as early as the age of 6 or 7. And so part of the issue is people don't look at racism or gendered violence or, as I said, healthcare as interconnected, interwoven systems, when realistically it is, like you said, it's easy to jump from one to the other because they're actually not like 3 separate circles. They're more like that Venn diagram where you do one circle here, one circle here, one circle here, and then you notice like, oh, wow, they all interconnect at a certain point. And I think that's really the truth of the matter. And it is just like you said, it's easy to jump from one to one to one because they are all birthed out of each other.
That's right. That's right. This is why if you don't mind, just let me go on a little tangent here. That's one of the reasons I throw people off with this show a little bit, because there's a generalized expectation because of my background that I would hold some of the same bigoted views and that I actually had once held. I mean, I wrote a book about, my past, growing from my religious context, and I can't even blame it all on religion. A lot of my growth had to come from just community and culture, movies that I watched, teaching me to have a bigoted view or use bigoted language as it pertains specifically to the LGBTQIA community. And so I have found in this space of trying to create something that everybody Black can be comfortable in, I found some of the most pushback that I get is right here at this specific intersection. When we try to open the doors of the church to everybody, it gets a little tricky. This is a facetious question, but have you ever run into that?
Oh, yeah, all the time. Yeah, all the time. And like you said, like even with the church, it's like, come as you are. And then in very small print, it's like, except if you are this, and this. Yeah. I mean, I will say, even with the book ban, I haven't run into as much pushback from pockets of Black communities as I anticipated, but a lot of the silence also still speaks volumes. And so it's kind of like where, these conservatives are very vocal and very loud. I'm not seeing like the historic Black organizations push back or say too much about the topic. And I think silence has a voice. And so I think right now what we're witnessing is how those organizations specifically, their silence is speaking volumes. Because just with my background of being a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, just with my background of being a 2-time HBCU alumnus, there's no reason that places like the NAACP haven't picked this up, and places like the Black churches aren't picking up the book bans. And right, I grew up with a Black grandmother who went to Mount Zion AME in Plainfield, New Jersey, and I went there, my whole life. And so I think it's the silence that speaks for a lot of those places and communities right now.
Yeah, it's a process, and we'll talk more, because I would love to get you back to talk even more about your second book that is rooted in our Blackness and is rooted in this journey. We Are Not Broken. If you don't mind telling us a little bit about that second book, and then tell us how our supporters can get both of them, because LeVar Burton said the best way to push back against banning books is to buy those books and read them.
Yeah. My second book, We Are Not Broken, is really a love letter to my grandmother, Nanny, who passed away December of 2019. It is the story of myself and my younger brother, as well as my 2 cousins. And for me, it's like this really coming of age story where you get to see how Black boys deserve to have childhoods and excitement and adventures and imaginations. And we had that, and we all had that with my grandmother. And so each of the grandchildren got to write a letter to her within the book. And it really is just a story about, Black boy joy at its core, and the Black grandmother experience, as she was just unwilling to allow us to not have a Black boy experience because of how hardened society tries to make us.
I'm definitely picking up that book, because I'm dealing with that right now, ensuring that my kids, particularly my boys, have the same access to joy, everything that you listed: joy, imagination, just fun. Like, can our kids let their hair down sometime? I mean, not me, but my kids, can they let their heads down and not have to be so hardened because of the nature of our society? George M. Johnson, thank you so much for joining us today. We have to get you back as soon as we can.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.